want us to come back to, what I want us to do first is to come back to this diagram that we looked at this morning. Because one of the things I might have asked you to do a few minutes ago, I asked you to write a 1-minute statement of what you thought the key learning point was. An alternative is sometimes to say to people, could you do a little drawing of what you think you've learned? Now that sort of takes people aback sometimes. I've had lots of people say to me, I don't draw. But that's okay. It's not a matter of artwork, it's a matter of conceptualizing what we're doing. And if I had said, could you draw a key point from the morning, maybe you would have drawn this, because this is really at the heart of what we were talking about this morning. We were talking, as I think Valencia may have been the person, Valencia, yeah. But I might have it wrong, who said this, brought out the term alignment. May have been Jonathan, I can't remember, it was Jonathan, thank you. It was over here, I knew that. We've been talking a lot about the importance of alignment between learning outcomes and objectives, then thinking about right away, how would we know if people have achieved those, feedback and assessment, and then what would we do to be sure people, our learners, have actually had the opportunity to move towards achieving those outcomes and objectives, and that would be our teaching and learning outcomes. Now what I'd like you to look at with that in mind is to pull out what I called sheet number 1, the bright pink one called beginning at the end. And I want to point out to us what our learning outcomes and our learning objectives are for this afternoon. Okay, so we can really keep those in mind. And you'll recall Corey did the same this morning, so we could be really clear and so we can model too what we're trying to do. So looking at the top of this page, you can see our learning outcomes for this afternoon. It's expected that by the end of this afternoon, participants in this workshop will, number 1, understand the value of creating clear learning outcomes and objectives, to really understand that. To understand how taxonomies of learning can be used. We're going to be talking about some of those. To know how to write learning outcomes and objectives, and then to value the importance of doing this. Those are our big overarching learning outcomes for this afternoon, okay? And we'll cycle back to those to be sure we're getting there as the afternoon goes on. Our objectives are, as Corey pointed out this morning, they're more precise, measurable, but they flow right from our outcomes. And our objectives for today, this afternoon, is that to determine if participants have achieved this, and in order to achieve these outcomes, it's expected that participants, by the end of this, will be able to write learning outcomes and objectives for a unit or a topic, presumably in this syllabus you brought. It's expected that you'll be able to compare and contrast taxonomies of learning, know why you might find one over another to be particularly relevant for you, and that you'd be able to explain to your colleagues, to someone else maybe who's not here, how taxonomies of learning could actually contribute to your writing of learning outcomes and objectives. Those could be measurable. We could measure those things if we chose to, and in fact, to a degree, that will happen in the workshop later this afternoon, where with your colleagues and facilitators, you'll be able to say, did I really get this? Can I actually write learning outcomes or objectives? Okay? So our structure for the next hour and a half or so is that we're going to talk some more about the integrated course design approach. And we started to talk about it this morning. We're also going to talk a little bit more in depth about learning outcomes. What are they? How do we know one when we are developing them? And kinds of learning outcomes. I get really quite excited about the kinds of learning outcomes, and I hope you will too. Because when I first, years ago, learned about it, my light bulb went off and I said, oh my goodness, there are different kinds of learning. That's really something for me to think about as a teacher. So I'm rather excited to share the fact that I think this is quite helpful to us as teachers. We'll investigate 2 particular taxonomies. There's actually other ones too, and so we want you to know that. But we're going to talk about 2 taxonomies, and then we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of how to develop them, okay? And Corey was mentioning this morning, and I want to mention also that depending on where you go to work when you leave here, there is somewhat different language that can be used. Sometimes you'll hear people talk about learning goals, as Corey mentioned. Sometimes learning outcomes. Sometimes some people use objectives and outcomes all sort of as the same thing. But we're trying to stick to some consistent language today, and we're emphasizing outcomes because it does emphasize that we're talking about how the learners learn, not just what we want to do as teachers. But be aware that the same principles work even if you encounter a somewhat different language. So let's go back to our diagram. Again, we're talking about integrated course design. We're going to be zeroing in a moment on learning outcomes and objectives. But before we get to that, I want to spend a tiny bit more time building on this morning on the notion of situational factors that you might want to be keeping in mind as you develop a course, and particularly your course outcomes. So what do we mean by that? Corey mentioned this morning, but I want us to think together about this for a minute. What are some of the situational factors that you might need to have in mind as you think about your learning outcomes? Well, you might need to think about the particular context in which you're teaching. Who are the students, for example? What are some of their characteristics? Are they first-year students? Are they advanced students? What kind of courses have they had before? You might, depending on what you're teaching, want to think about what are employers expecting somebody would be able to do after they have experienced this course or this program? What about our accrediting agencies? What do they expect? We might want to think about the subject matter itself. How is it best organized? Is it something like history that often we think about chronologically but doesn't have to be thought about chronologically? Is it something where we need to learn certain things before we can learn other things? What's the structure of our subject? And that varies. Who am I as a teacher? What am I comfortable with? Where am I going to have to work a little harder? Those are some of the situational factors we want to kind of have in the back of our minds as we think about our learning outcomes. And what I'd like us to do here for just a minute is for you to take literally 30 seconds this time and just jot down what are some of the situational factors that you want to keep in mind for the course that you're working on, that you brought the syllabus. And it can be any of these things. In 30 seconds, you only have a chance to write down it. Now let's get back to our really zero in on our topic here on definition of learning outcomes. That's really our primary goal this afternoon. And I wanted to emphasize again, if you hear learning goals, if I say learning goals, we're talking about the same thing. Intended learning outcomes are learning goals in the language that Corey and I have laid out for us here. I just prefer intended learning outcomes because it keeps our mind on the fact that this is all about student learning. It's not about what we just happen to like to teach about, okay? So what do we mean by an intended learning outcome or a learning goal? Well, basically it's a statement of what the learner is to learn. Again, the emphasis right back on the learner. What's the learner going to learn? What will the learner be able to do as a result of the learning process? Or another way to say it is, what's the end result of that learning process? And that's why we called this, thanks to Corey's clever titling, beginning at the end. So we're always saying, at the end of this, what will the learner be able to do, know, understand? We're going to talk about what some of those outcomes could be as we go along. So where do we start when we're doing this? Where do we start? One of the ways that I like to start, and it actually builds on what all of you were saying, is to say, when I'm dreaming about this course, when I say dreaming, I use that word advisedly, but that is thinking about it, getting excited about it, envisioning it. When I'm doing that, I might ask myself at the end of it, what will the students have learned? What's my vision for this? What do I want for them? Now, you might even in words like dream, there's a degree of passion in that, isn't there? I mean, it conveys, I love what I teach. And so I want to think about what is it that I want these learners to really love and value and be able to do. Another thing I might say to myself is, okay, people are going to be in this course, and they're going to learn lots of things, but they're going to be taking other courses, and some of those things they might forget after a while. So if I think out a year from now, what is it that I want to have really stay with the learners a year from now? Do you see how that kind of question would make me really have to say, what's really important? What's going to actually stay with the learner a year hence, not just the day they happen to be in class? Does that make sense? See nods on that one? Okay. So you can be thinking about that with your class. What is it you really envision as what's really important that the students will actually be able to do or know or understand or apply when they finish? I wanted just to spend a moment to say, why bother to write them? Some people actually don't write them. They say, well, I know what's going to be in my class, so, I don't need to spend that time. So I hear a few people chuckling at that. That's not such a great way to do it, basically, I would say. So why write them? I offered a few ideas up here, and you might have some ideas too. One of the reasons to literally write your outcomes down is to be sure, again, that student learning is at the focus of all of our planning, of all of our teaching. Teaching is not a matter of what topics we happen to like and that we want to share, though that's certainly important because our passion and our love of what we teach is important, but that's only part of it. These outcomes, writing these outcomes reminds us that really what we're about is helping the learners achieve the learning that is appropriate for that course. Why else might we write them? Well, I said it really helps us as a teacher so that we know what's going to be assessed. That's a really good reason, and this takes us right back again to what I call the circle of three circles: outcomes, assessment, learning activities. And if we actually know what the outcomes are, we can think a lot more easily, actually, about how we would assess them. How many of you have been in classes in your academic experience where you've, say, gotten to a test as a form of assessment and looked at a question and said, that has nothing to do with anything that we actually learned about here? Have you had that experience? That's what we're talking about here. It's a horrible experience, just horrible. I can remember one of those so vividly when I was at high school, actually, in a science class. And I read the problem, and I thought, I don't know how to do that. And I don't think I was pretty good about doing my homework and things. I thought, I don't think they ever taught us how to do that. I'm kind of nervous here because I didn't like the fact that I was looking at an exam where it had seemingly the assessment did not relate to what we had done or to what I understood the outcomes are. That's what we're talking about here. So if we actually write down the outcomes, it actually becomes quite easy and fun to think about the assessments, which is what you're going to have more opportunity to do tomorrow, to think about assessment. Well, another reason that I like to actually write the learning outcomes, intended learning outcomes down, is that it helps me to think about what would be appropriate learning activities. What would actually serve the learning of these outcomes? Have you sometimes, maybe as a teacher, had the experience where you thought, you know what, I just absolutely think tomorrow that we should have a case. We're going to do a case tomorrow. And then you think, this is going to be great. But then, after you start to plan it, you think, now, actually, how did that case relate to what we're supposedly learning here? Do you know of that disconnect? Some of us get very excited as teachers about a great idea, but if it doesn't serve the learning outcome, it's a good idea that doesn't necessarily have the right purpose. It's like buying a great chair for your living room, only to get home to find out you had enough chairs in your living room already, or that chair didn't fit. We need to have our learning activities support our outcomes. So if we write down the outcomes, put them up on our computer, put them on the syllabus, put them on our bathroom mirror, we can remember what they are a lot better. And then another reason to write them down is it lets us communicate to our colleagues, to the students, to sometimes if you're doing a review for your department, maybe for the provost's office or for an accrediting agency, you know what you're about there. So it's a great way, if you've written your learning outcomes down, you can communicate with your colleagues and say, the learners in my classes or my course will have achieved this, and therefore they will be ready for when they take your course. If we don't know what those outcomes are, it's extremely hard to have that conversation. So generally, when we're talking about learning outcomes or learning goals, usually the people who write about these talk about three kinds. They usually talk about knowledge and understanding. Those are often called cognitive outcomes. And those are the ones that we hear about the most, actually. And we'll, in a minute, be talking about Bloom's taxonomy, which is excellent in helping us really zero in on different types of cognitive outcomes. Cognitive outcomes, knowledge, understanding. But many people, particularly in more recent years, have said, you know, there's other kinds of outcomes that we want to think about. And sometimes we don't think about these as much. And it somewhat depends on what field you're in as to how much your colleagues are likely to think about these. But there's also outcomes that are often called psychomotor outcomes or skills. I call them skills because it's just a shorter word to remember. I like to make it so I can get my mind around it pretty well. So we're going to talk about what some of those skills might be. But just as a little preview, you can probably guess. Skills might be, if you're a scientist, my understanding is there's certain things you actually have to learn how to do in the laboratory, that if you literally don't know how to do certain tasks, it will be difficult to do certain experiments. So there's certain skills. If you're studying social work, you may need to learn the skills of how to write certain kinds of reports that perhaps the state requires or school systems require. So that there's those sorts of things. Oh, I'm sorry. Whoop, I want to come back one more time. And then there's values and attitudes. And a lot of times we don't talk about these as much, but we're going to talk about them a little bit today. And we often call these affective outcomes. They have to do with valuing what we're doing. And just as a preview, we'll talk about this a little bit more, but I teach in education. I teach people often who are preparing to teach at the college level. And one of the affective outcomes is that I would like the people who are in my classes as an intended learning outcome to develop a real passion for actually what we're talking about, for supporting learning, not just for sharing content knowledge. That's part of it, but for actually supporting learning. And so that's an attitude or a value. I would think if I were teaching in any area, in psychology, I would hope that I would have as an intended learning outcome that I would want students to value, if I were in psychology perhaps, the importance of a career of service to others. So that's an affective outcome. Everybody with me here? Looking around at faces a little bit. So let's dig in now on probably what is the most well-known taxonomy. And we have people in the room here who use this a great deal. Our colleague Diane Ebert-May uses it a lot and has a lot of knowledge about this. I use it in my teaching, and I know Deb DeJour and other people in this room are very familiar with this. So I'll welcome my colleagues if they want to add a word or two as we go along here. That will be just fine. Bloom's taxonomy is focused on cognitive outcomes, the knowledge, the understandings, okay? So we're in the cognitive domain. And this again is probably the most well-known taxonomy. And this is just one way to look at it. I'm going to move to this next one because it brings out some of the things that I want to say. What Bloom's taxonomy? Here are some of the reasons Bloom's taxonomy is so helpful to us. Number one, it gives us actual words that we can use to go beyond, I want students to know something. Because knowing is kind of broad. It doesn't get us as deep into what actually is the learner going to be able to do when they finish or know. And what Bloom's taxonomy does is say there are different kinds of cognitive outcomes, and it actually shows, Bloom talks about it in a hierarchical kind of way. I want to say a little bit about that. That at the lowest level, what we often call the lowest level in this taxonomy, we talk about knowledge. This is the blue area down here. What does that have to do with? It has to do with a student outcome being to recall information, to know various facts, to be able to find various facts. It's the lowest level, knowing something exists, knowing a fact, having mastery of a certain information. That's a part of knowing, certainly, right? But it's not necessarily as advanced as we often want our students to go. So we build on that. And Bloom says, well, then there's also a little bit higher is comprehension. I can know certain things. I can know maybe the names of the planets. That would be a good thing to know if I were studying astronomy in the most basic sense. I know there's a lot more about astronomy than that, but in a very basic sense, that would be a starter. But just knowing the names of the planets, I don't comprehend very much about how those planets are arranged or the characteristics of a planet or why they have certain features to them that make them distinct. That has to do with more understanding, going deeper than just having basic knowledge and facts. But then there's more about cognitive outcomes. Oftentimes, we don't want to leave it there. We want our students to be able to apply what they've learned. That's usually what we want. We want students to be able to know certain information, say in history, but then be able to apply that information, say about World War II or some other war in the past, and then take that information and be able to use it in some kind of way, to analyze. That's actually moving us into the next level, to be able to analyze something else. It's not just knowing the battles in World War II or some of the factors that started World War II. We want students to be able to apply knowledge and then moving a little further to be able to analyze new situations use the knowledge they had. In science, it's not simply a matter of knowing something about molecular structure. We often want students to be able to take that to frame new questions. That moves us even higher into synthesizing information and then moving so that we can use concepts to create new ideas. And then we want students, often at the higher level even, to be able to evaluate, to have theoretical ideas, to be able to assess their strengths and weaknesses, to be able to compare or judge the quality of ideas. Do you recognize these things as things you want your students to be able to do? Now, what's important here, though, is that these build on each other. Now, in our courses, we usually, at the college level, often want students at these higher levels. But we often make a mistake because we say sometimes that our learning outcome goal is at a lower level than we intend. So we've got to really think, what is it that we really want as a learning outcome? What level is it? And then one of the reasons I like Bloom's taxonomy is because if we indeed say want students to be able to analyze, if I say that, if that's the outcome, I've got to stop and say to myself, do they have all the knowledge they need to be able to do that? Do they have the basic level knowledge? It's pretty tough to analyze if you don't have some of the knowledge. Do they have that? Do they understand that? Do they know how to apply that knowledge? It helps me think of all the components of my teaching to be sure that we're getting to the level of outcome that we want. Bloom's taxonomy, a lot has been written about it. You have in your notes various references, and you'll be working in your groups more, and particularly in your disciplinary breakout groups. That will be helpful. What I want to do, keeping an eye on the time, is move us to another taxonomy that may be less familiar to some of you. But I actually think it works quite nicely with Bloom's taxonomy. It's not necessarily an either or. It just gives us an additional way to think about learning outcomes. And this one is Fink's taxonomy. You have your handouts, what I call number 2 and 3, the one that's a circle, and then the one that's called major categories in the taxonomy of significant learning. Fink has written about the variety of outcomes. He researched a lot of different ways that taxonomies were developed. And what he said is, let's think about outcomes, learning outcomes, in terms of 6 domains. Okay? And I particularly like this one because it does capture the cognitive as well as the affective and the skill aspect. So I'm not giving you these as an either or. I'm giving you both Bloom because it's so well established and respected. And as you could see in our conversation here, there's many nuances to think about with Bloom. And then I'm giving you this one because I think it helps us think about also the affective and the skill, the psychomotor skills too. So we'll highlight what some of these outcomes are in this one, domain outcomes. The first thing that Fink talks about is that there are outcomes that have, this is really a cognitive outcome, somewhat like Bloom, that has to do with developing real understanding in the subject matter. This is he calls it foundational knowledge, an outcome of getting foundational knowledge in your area. Understanding basic information and ideas. But one can, I think about foundational knowledge is related. You can kind of map it against Bloom also, I think. But this has to do with knowing facts, data, relationships in your field, and what those foundational aspects of foundational knowledge would be relate, as Nancy said, to the discipline you're in. Disciplines have different structures. They have different histories. They have moved to more or less different degrees towards deep knowledge. So foundational knowledge will vary in terms of the discipline. But one type of outcome then are outcomes, learning outcomes that have to do with foundational knowledge in the particular subject matter. Then we have application. Now right away you'll recognize this as one of the middle levels in Bloom's taxonomy. Fink calls this, it's sort of its own domain. And he says that application has to do with outcomes where we're learning how to use knowledge in various ways. How to use knowledge, how to apply certain skills, how to manage what he calls complex projects. A complex project might be a research paper or an experiment, depending on what your field is. And he also talks about application as having to do with thinking outcomes that have to do with thinking. And our colleague Anna back here talked about thinking before, critical thinking as being an outcome that's very important to her in the philosophy area. So I want to spend a little bit more time on this application area. This domain of outcomes around application, what are some of the outcomes in that? Well, some of them could be outcomes that are specific skills in our domain of work. It might be certain physical skills, as I said, in a laboratory, knowing how to use certain equipment, when, under what conditions, and actually how to use the equipment. It might be your learning outcome for your course might have to do with advancing writing. Moving the learner, as I said in my second point here, on a continuum from novice to more competent to expert. And certainly in any one course, we're not necessarily always moving people along that full continuum. Our goal may be at the lower end of the continuum. I teach, some of the people in this room have been in it, a course for our doctoral students who are starting out in our department. And one of the learning outcomes of that course is for students to move along the continuum of writing expertise. But not just general writing expertise in some of the scholarly genres that are used in our particular field. So it's not writing a short story, though that would be great if I were in the English department, but it's writing that has to do with the scholarly writing that's appropriate in our body of, my field of study. So that's an application kind of outcome. Now there's other application outcomes that Fink talks about. He says another kind of application learning outcome is learning how to manage what he calls complex projects. This might be learning how to conduct a research study in one's field. It might have to do with an engineering, learning how to solve certain problems. To solve problems, you need to have a lot of the knowledge that Bloom's taxonomy has brought to our attention, but you have to know how to bring it together and actually apply that. It could be if you're in a public policy, or I think somebody here said they're in fisheries and fisheries and wildlife. Perhaps it has to do with managing certain things. I know in this state there's a feral pig problem. I've learned from my husband, who's been working with the fisheries and wildlife people. And how to develop an appropriate statewide plan to manage the feral pig population would be an example, perhaps, of an applied activity that would move students on a continuum of learning toward higher level application abilities. And then Fink talks about application as also pertaining to outcomes that have to do with learning how to think. And he talks about several kinds of thinking. Some of our outcomes have to do, Anna called it critical thinking, being able to analyze, evaluate, judge. And oftentimes, this still might be using laboratory equipment, but knowing how to analyze, when would I actually use this piece of equipment? Under what conditions? What does this piece of equipment help me know? What does it not help me know? We can have creative thinking that Fink distinguishes from critical thinking. The ability to imagine, to create, perhaps, is an outcome that you wish for your students to move towards. I want the students in the course I teach about research design to develop creative thinking. I'm not talking about writing a poem, though that's very important, but not in my field. I'm talking about creative thinking about how to frame a problem that's worthy of research. That's a very big learning outcome for people who are doctoral students, as you probably well know. How to find a problem, frame it, be able to explain why it is a problem. Some of you, I hope, if you're doctoral students, you probably know that. That's very challenging. That's a form of creative thinking. And it's an outcome, a learning outcome, for one of the courses that I teach. Okay? And then there's practical thinking, might be an outcome of a course. How to make decisions, how to answer questions. If you're in a public policy, teaching a public policy course, one of the intended learning outcomes may be for students to develop the practical thinking that lets them analyze a water-related problem in cities, and then figure out what are the factors contributing to this, what are the possible options, and why is one option better than another option. These are practical thinking outcomes. Well, here I actually had a couple examples. So this is an example from history. of 3 kinds of questions that might be addressed in a course that illustrate types of thinking. So in critical thinking, we could ask, how did events in post-World War II Germany lead to the rise of Nazism? That's a critical analytical question, right? Or we might want students to go beyond that and be creative about their thinking and think of other possibilities than what happened historically. How might President Truman, have encouraged the surrender of Japan without dropping the atomic bomb? That's taking historical knowledge and thinking creatively, applying it, analyzing, thinking of all the possibilities that might have been at play. Or taking this example, practical thinking. What lessons does the rise of Nazism hold for events today? This is taking this knowledge, applying, synthesizing, evaluating current situations. So I hope you can see some of the parallel with Bloom's work to these kinds of thinking outcomes. Now, there's another example. You can look at it also from biology. I think right now I'm going to move forward, keeping my eye on the time, but it's in your packet. So you can see, and we collected some examples right here from all of you. But let's move to one of Fink's other domains. He talks about integration as another domain in which we might identify intended outcomes. And here he says that the outcomes would have to do with learning how to connect things, how to connect people, how to connect ideas, how to connect different parts of life. Now you might be saying, what would that mean? Learning to make connections as an outcome. Sometimes we want our learners, depending on what we're teaching, to learn how to make connections from our field to another field. Sometimes we want our learners to be able to connect, Fink would say, that led us to think about, our academic life with life beyond the academic walls. And that's often why we encourage students to get involved, say, in service learning or in projects that take them beyond the particular, more specific boundaries within the academy. It has to do with connecting what they're learning with issues beyond the academy, with so-called, as we sometimes say, real life. Those are outcomes that have to do with integration of knowledge. A couple other domains Fink emphasizes, and we've started to touch on those, what he calls the human dimension, the learning outcomes that have to do with what he calls the human dimension, learning about oneself and others. Sometimes in our courses, we have an overarching learning goal where we want students to develop a new self-image or a vision of who they could be. Perhaps a vision, there's lots of work being done on women and girls in science. I would suspect, I don't teach science, but I would suspect we have many professors in science areas who would hope that both men and women in their courses would develop images of women as excellent scientists as well as men as excellent scientists, or would hope that some of the female students might envision as an outcome of the course that they themselves might pursue a career in science. This is in the human dimension domain. Sometimes we want students to develop new understandings of other people as part of the courses, or even of other things, of technology. I can recall many years ago when I started in graduate school taking a statistics course. I was incredibly nervous about even using the computer. It was before laptops. This was back in the dark ages. And literally in this class, the first assignment, about 5 of us went to the computer lab together because we were really afraid we might break the machines. That sounds crazy now, but it's absolutely true. And one of the outcomes of that course was that we would develop a sense of ease at using the computer and using the statistics that we were learning how to use. That would be a human dimension outcome. Whoop. There we go. Also in the affective domain, what Fink calls outcomes that pertain to caring, the caring domain, developing deeper or new feelings about subject matter or about the phenomenon under study or about even the process of learning. One of the intended learning outcomes that I have when I'm teaching doctoral students and master's students is I'd like as an outcome of one of our courses that I teach for students to actually enjoy writing, enjoy scholarly writing, and not be afraid of it. Or see some of the students here smiling have been in that class. To think this is something that's stimulating, it's intellectually exciting to me. That has to do with an intended learning outcome that has to do with developing a sense of care, valuing of a certain scholarly activity, writing, academic writing. And then the sixth one that Fink talks about is that we often have intended learning outcomes that have to do with learning how to learn. Oftentimes we don't state these, but we actually have them in the back of our mind. And Fink would say, let's actually state them. That we want our students, depending on what level they are, it may vary, but we want them to learn more about the process of learning. We want them to learn how to be more directed themselves as learners. Now, I'll use an example in my own classes for doctoral students. I want one of the outcomes for the first level doctoral class that I often teach is I want our students to learn how to read the scholarly literature. Because there's a huge amount of scholarly literature, there's not enough time to read it all. So you have to have a strategy for how to do that. So I have an intended learning outcome that students will develop a strategy for how they can handle this constantly growing body of work. So that would be an example of an outcome that has to do with learning how to learn. So Fink's taxonomy, I think, is very useful at also giving us some ways to think about what are these intended learning outcomes. Now, I want to prepare us now. We're coming toward our end in a few minutes, but I want to prepare us for what you're going to be doing this afternoon. Okay? What we have so far, I hope, accomplished is that we've learned about Bloom's taxonomy. We've learned about the nuances, the discussions. It's a very rich taxonomy. We've also been introduced to Fink's taxonomy, which talks about 6 domains that include cognitive, affect, and skill domains. What I want to, well, let's see here. Where did I go just then? I went to that. Oh. I think we've already done this, brainstormed some outcomes. I'm not going to linger on this now, and you'll be doing this more. We've also talked a bit, I'll just briefly say that I like Fink's because it does bring out multiple learning outcomes, not only cognitive. It's very useful when we know that knowledge is expanding all the time. Fink reminds us that one of our learning outcome areas can actually be helping our learners learn how to deal with expanding knowledge. And I like the fact that it's not hierarchical, that we can link these learning outcomes in ways that can show that the same learning activity can lead to multiple outcomes. Now, how do we develop these? This is what you're going to be working on this afternoon. What we want to recognize is that and we've been talking about overarching general outcomes, our goals, sometimes called. And then we will link to each of those outcomes specific objectives that become more measurable. The kinds of outcomes we've talked about tend to be global. We then have to figure out how to indicate ways that they can be more specific and more focused. Just to summarize our big points here, what we're arguing throughout this day or helping us all to think about is how important it is to align our intended learning outcomes, to start with that, and to align our assessment, our learning activities, and our outcomes. And to start with the outcomes, to start with what are students going to have learned, what will they know, what can they do, and then figure out how will we know if they've achieved that, and what are the learning activities that will help them do it. So if I were to say, we won't do this now, but could we draw a little drawing for ourselves of what we learned, what I hope people might have as maybe part of their drawing is something like this, keeping in mind the constant alignment between outcomes, intended outcomes, assessment, and activities, and then pushing ourselves to really think, what is it we want students to learn, and to go beyond just platitudes and think about these domains of learning, Bloom's and Fink's, there are others too, and push ourselves to say these are the set of big learning outcomes, and for each of those, here are specific objectives with verbs that we can actually assess that we are supporting our students to achieve as they participate in our courses. The emphasis is on what is learned too. So with that, we're going to break, and the suggested activity, your facilitators, I think, will adjust this as is appropriate for your group, but as Corey and I worked, we suggested that you focus on the syllabus that you've been working on, maybe a unit of that, And this morning you were looking at maybe where were the gaps, what was the state of your outcomes as they exist now. Now we suggest that you actually try to write a few learning outcomes for your syllabus and some related objectives. And then to discuss how that works and where are the alignments, and to use each other as colleagues to check each other on that. So good luck this afternoon, and I hope this was useful.
Thank you.